Welcome to this Open Security Summit session. I want to give you a quick introduction to what we're doing and what to expect. So all sessions at the Open Security Summit are live streamed or recorded, and we share them for public use. And we publish them on the Open Security Summit YouTube channel, and we highly recommend you to go there and check out these amazing sessions that we already have there from the Current Summit and the training session that happened before. We want you to be involved, share with your network, and please share the Zoom links that exist on the OSS website, which you can find here, and these allow you to log in straight away and see the sessions. We have an amazing content for this week, from CISO to cloud security to CDR to COVID to DevSecOps, and also a number of sessions on other topics which are super critical and important for us to address, including Wardley maps, which is a big feature of the summit. And we go every day from 10:30 till 10 o'clock at night. And as you can see, there's something for everybody here. So please be involved, participate, and join us. And just a final comment on openness and respect. At the summit, everything we do is about openness. We share the information, but also we try to release everything that is created under Creative Commons and an open source license. And we expect you to participate, to have mutual respect, to have an objective distance on your comments, and to be very professional. And finally, we put a huge focus on respect. We have a diverse community. This is about respecting everybody's opinion, and we expect nobody to feel discriminated or not comfortable during the sessions. We also support heavily the Black Lives Matter current situation that happened worldwide, because we believe that is super important to reset how we address these important issues in our society. Finally, share your views. Here's the hashtag to use, and we have a Slack environment that you can join from the website homepage and enjoy and learn. Over to you, Mario.
Yep, thank you. So let me share my screen. All right, can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Yep, okay. So this session is going to be different from some of the other sessions that we've had. So I'm on purpose doing a presentation on Wardley mapping that does not include any Wardley maps. So we'll be talking about applying some of the concepts, particularly with regards to climatic patterns and also doctrine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what I believe are 4 problems that affect the cybersecurity industry, and how we can use climatic patterns and doctrine to discuss the problems and to understand their effects on our industry as a whole, and also what we can do in our own organizations to take advantage or reduce some of these problems in our own organizations. So those 4 problems are the communication problem, the engineering problem, the management problem, and the skills and structure problem. And we're going to be spending a lot of time on the communication one, because I think it's one of the most important, and then we'll also be touching on the other 3 problems. So as I mentioned, not a single talk map in this talk. I wanted to be the first one to ever doing such a thing, but a cat sweatel beat me to it. So unfortunately, I cannot claim to be the first one, but yeah, that's that's the first thing. So I really like the way Kat talks about the difference between Wardley map and Wardley mapping. So obviously, Wardley map is an artifact, a great one for sure, but my particular interest on this talk is really on attaining a shared vocabulary that we can talk about components and their evolution, rather than talking about the artifact that it can produce. Okay. So we'll be focusing, as I mentioned, on doctrine and climatic patterns. So this is also not an introduction to Wardley mapping. So if that's what you're looking for, there were about 5 or 6 sessions already on introduction to Wardley mapping. So this would not be the right one for that. The good news is that you don't actually need to know about Wardley mapping for any of the things that I'm going to talk about make sense. And that's what I think is the beauty of Wardley mapping as a conversational tool, right? So on us attaining a shared vocabulary that we can have meaningful conversations on. So what we'll do today is applying these climatic patterns in Doctrine as a way of assessing our landscape and the forces that are acting on it, right? So just as the two pieces of quick reminders that I'm going to do regards to Wardley mapping is so Doctrine are universally useful principles that can be applied independent of context, right? So I like to summarize it as good management, which obviously needs to apply in our context. Right? And that's how we'll be applying some of these ideas to cybersecurity industry. And climate are the external forces that are acting on our landscape. And the climatic patterns are why the rules of the game or patterns of seasons, right? So Wardley's climatic patterns are very well curated and researched, and they've shown to be stable, some for centuries, others for millennia. And so we know that we can use them to discuss some of these patterns. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some methods and frameworks that already exist as security things and where we can learn from, and also where you can learn from other areas to further progress ours. Right. So one of the challenges that I think the security industry has is that we tend to think we were the first ones facing a type of problem, but I'm a big believer in trying to learn from other areas that have gone through similar issues and try to learn what they've done to address them. Obviously, this is going to be my view of it. There will certainly, as with Doctrine, there will be better Doctrine and probably different climatic patterns in the future. But for the moment, I think these are useful ideas. And the main thing that I'd like to do with this talk is at the end of the to see if we can agree and put on a GitHub page, something like that, how to apply in context of cybersecurity some of these climatic patterns and Doctrine elements, and also expand the conversation for further people to collaborate on it as well. So before going further, there's something that I'd like to make clear before internalizing or making sense of what's coming next. And I think this is relevant to both sense making with regards to Canavan and other things, but also on setting strategy for Wardley mapping. So we sometimes in security have security leaders that like to go into a problem space already knowing all of the answers and what the strategy needs to look like before really understanding what are the affordances that are provided by the environments that we're in. Right? So when we go into an organization already with all of these answers of how we want to do things because we did it elsewhere, then we will find ourselves having struggling to get actual situational awareness if we've already framed the problem as something of a particular nature and we've already decided up front how we're going to treat the problem, right? So having a clear understanding of what are the affordances that are provided to us by the environment we're in will make certain options available and that the strategy is completely unfeasible, right? So the environment that we're in, the landscape that we are is going to dictate what kind of strategies we have available to us, okay? And that's something that I'd like to stress up front because none of these are recipes. These things are tools to help us think, right? Typologies. So in terms of the four cybersecurity problems we're going to talk about, these are the ones. So communications problem, engineering problem, management problem, and the skills and structure problem. So in the problem that we all seem to agree on is that we struggle to communicate with the business, or why they should care about what we say, the things we propose, right? And at least there seems to be some agreement on that, right? We generally, I think everyone agrees that there's an issue with communication between security and our businesses. What we don't often talk about is how security teams also regularly struggle communicating within themselves. So within the CISO function, the different teams such as compliance, risk management, incident management, or security engineering, and the challenge of communicating in that space, right? And this also affects us as an industry overall, and I think there are things we can do to address that. So if we look at this from you trying to apply a lens of Doctrine to talk about this communication problem, the first one is I think we need to get better at adopting common languages. Right? With this, we can, applying some security things to how we can approach adoption of common language, we can think about using architectural methods that help us connect concerns at different levels of the organization, using subset. We're going to go through that in detail. So every item that you see in bold are things that we're going to go deeper into in the next slides. Adopt a threat taxonomy as a categorization system, and also adopt cybersecurity style guides to normalize security language across the organization. So with regards to situational awareness, so we know that there's a correlation between awareness and performance, and companies and teams who are aware tend to perform better. Right? If you're not part of ceremonies or benefit from feedback loops from those ceremonies, then you're not situationally aware, right? Because our digital front lines are our development teams, our engineering teams, and if we don't find the ways to directly benefit from the weekly sprint definitions, the feedback loops that they get when they do things, we're missing a lot on overall situational awareness, right? And also, another thing to note is that situational awareness happens at different time spans. Right? So there is one thing, situational awareness for an executive will mean one thing, situational awareness for a developer will mean something completely different. Right? And when we're thinking about situational awareness in a fractal form, we need to be thinking about these different levels of concerns. And I'm going to introduce a model also to talk about that. And also, most critically, we need to challenge assumptions and have an environment where people feel psychologically safe in doing so, right? But the first thing on challenging the assumptions is that we should not think that when we get into, as leaders, security managers or CISOs or whatever, when we get into a new organization, it's very unlikely that you're going to do this effectively within your first year of joining an organization, right? For a few different reasons. The first one is challenging assumptions requires trust, and trust takes time to build. And not only that, whenever we start in a new role, there's always going to be a honeymoon period where people will tell you what you want to hear, right? Not necessarily the things that they're thinking about. So understanding that this trust is going to have to be built is key to set good expectations. And also, and even above that, is that a culture acts as a dark constraint, right? You may not be able to see it, but you do feel its effects. So until you need to develop the sensitivity to understand the culture that of a new environment that you come in, and that is also going to take time. Okay. But for that, obviously, you need to have you need to have an open door policy, and people need to come to you with problems. And you need to give them some sense of agency of trying to fix the problems they come to you with. Because if someone is telling you about a problem, it's likely that they've got a few ideas on how you can potentially address it. So overall, and this is a fractal application of the concept, but usually the climatic pattern of evolution of communication can increase the speed of evolution overall, is usually applied to things such as, for instance, broadband and high bandwidth being available, and now we can communicate quicker. So there's a few things that we can do now that we couldn't previously. Or for instance, the evolution of trains. Right, where we now could connect distant areas much quicker, and that will enable other things to evolve. But I think it also applies at a micro level within organizations. So if we can evolve our communication within and outside the security teams and organizations, we have a much better chance to significantly accelerate the evolution of our security practices. So on situational awareness, so this is based on Jay Bloom's talk. I will quote him a lot throughout my talk, as I usually do. But this is about what he calls the time span of discretion. So it's the scope of responsibility against the complexity of decisions. And this relates directly to situational awareness and observability of decisions made. Okay. So there are a few activities that we perform in security that we need to do the work to connect them better. Right? So how we are assessing the things at a high level using Wardley mapping or Cynefin framework, and then with execs, this is particularly relevant when we're looking at multi-year, highly complex decisions. So why should we be pursuing a particular strategy in lieu of another one? but also at the VP and director level, right? Where we've got practices like risk management that work well. So because that helps us answer, how am I going to win this game against that opponent with these capabilities? Right? Or if I know how the threat landscape is evolving, what am I doing today to help me better withstand the potential impact a year down the line, right? And this expertise and analysis plays a big role here. But also we need to understand that the observability cycle of these things are different, right? Because a risk may or may not materialize, right? So if we're going to be talking about management of risk with knowledge workers, they will generally not care, right? Because they don't understand what it means to them. So they're going to be worried about planning their next 3 sprints, and we're telling them that something may hit us 5 or 7 years down the line, right? We need to start really understanding the type of stakeholders that we're having conversations with and adapting how we are approaching security, about how we're talking about security in the time span that the stakeholders are comfortable in dealing with. Right. And that's where, for instance, when talking about knowledge workers, where we've got techniques such as threat modeling that helps them identify a threat and, okay, this is what I can do in the next 2 or 3 sprints to address that. Right. So the governance work is really not, again, not one size fits all. It's about thinking about how we can apply different aspects of governance and how we can connect them together at these different levels of time spans. So this is an example of how we can potentially approach this. And this is using the risk modeling techniques from SAPSA. So at the strategic level, the C-suite will be concerned about a strategic risk. They will want to ensure they're doing something to be a trusted business, a reputable business. What that means to the risk management or to the level of VPs and directors, it's about having hardened or recoverable systems. And when we're doing this type of risk modeling, we should be thinking about key risk indicators that can help us make management decisions, right? So for instance, using this hardened example, we can say, agree on a key risk indicator that says 65% of my confidential system components will have a security baseline, right? And then we can use this idea of how much we think this to be a risk in the organization, the percentages that needs to be adapted to each organization, and think, how can I translate it into threat modeling? How can I help inform the threat modeling process by thinking about these risks that the organization is exposed to? And this is where we can think of threat modeling as the threat is going to be the threat of security misconfiguration. The mitigation I need to do is develop and apply a baseline. And my continuous validation of that is going to be a check with compliance as code that is going to ensure that I've got my security baseline being met. Right? In doing this kind of consistently across our risks and threat landscapes. And this gives us that view of situational awareness across different levels, or helps inform that. So this is an actual SAPSA traceability, where we can think at the higher level, what are the business attributes. So business as enabler, not business as a collection of controls, where we can think about what it means to different stakeholders and connect them through a chain of needs on how we can, what's relevant to VP and directors, and lastly, what's relevant to knowledge workers. So what are the actual security mechanisms, the components, the tools, the standards, and those things, and have a method or a methodology that helps us connect all of this throughout the whole chain of time spans. The other aspect that I think is important on adopting common language is that when we look at a particular problem, people will use the language they're comfortable with. So if I go talk with Anna, the tech gal, she'll be talking to me about engineering, tools and trade-offs, or if I say something about compliance or risk, she's going to tell me the trade-offs in the constraints that may or may not make that control feasible, right? If I'm talking with a security manager, he's going to be typically concerned with shareholder pressures, business attributes, the business value of assets. So am I going to be spending 1 million to protect something that is worth 500K? Probably not. So there will be the security manager's type of lingo, right? Then we've got the security product specialists, where we've got the sales speak, Gartner-infused buzzwords, so the people that actually know their security vendors very well in the vendor landscape, the feature differentiation, so that type of stuff. Then if I go talk with Sushma, the incident responder, she's going to be telling me about the SLAs, recovery procedures, indicators of compromise, those things that are part of her daily work. And if I'm going to be talking with Felipe, the compliance guy, he's going to tell me about control testing, evidence review, checklists and spreadsheets, because that's kind of the language that he usually deals in. But this is just security, right? And we've got here 5 different roles within security that have completely different languages that they use on a daily basis. Right? So this is what I mean by the challenge of communication within security teams. Right? One technique that I think is very useful to do is using threat taxonomies as categorization systems. Okay, so here we've got the example of the ENISA threat taxonomy. At the high level, you probably can't see it very well, but I've got some links that I'm going to provide. But the highest level categories are legal, nefarious activity and abuse, eavesdropping, interception and hijacking, physical attacks, unintentional damages, disasters, damage and loss of IT assets, and also failures and malfunctions. Right? So I don't suggest using this as copy-paste, but as adapting the parts that are more relevant to our organizations and use them. And I've got here an example on how to use that to talk about a phishing incident. So we had Sushma using detecting a phishing incident. So we know that the incident was that a contact center user clicked on a malicious link and they got infected with malware. And that's from a threat taxonomy point of view, that's about a threat of malicious code and receiving an unsolicited email. Right? She also identified a vulnerability in that the mail filter didn't detect this malware because it was outdated. So here we've got the threat of erroneous administration of devices. And the corrective control to fix that was to update the filter with the latest signatures. And that was the corrective control we've put in place to deal with the threat of erroneous administration of devices. But that wasn't the only problem. So we also, because we had the outbreak, Anna, she also understood that the host AV did not detect this or contain this malware. So this was the threat of inadequate adaptation of what we have internally in terms of our security capabilities. We have the same vulnerability on the filter because she'll be concerned about that, and so will Peter, the security product specialist. And the corrective control they're putting in place, which is also relevant to Felipe, is to improve this operational process on mail filter management. Right? So it's the threat of inadequate design and planning, right? That we want to address by putting in this particular type of corrective control. And finally, Felipe is mostly concerned about risks. Right, in the compliance stuff. So he understood that whilst we had this incident outgoing, that the operators can't perform the customer service function. So this is the threat of loss of support services. Also, we are a SaaS B2B business, so we know that this relates to clause 12.4 of our standard contractual clauses, that we do these things on a regular basis, and this affects 120 contracts. And this is about the failure to meet contractual requirements. And also, our customer service function loss leads to our breach of contractual SLA, right? So this will lead us to a couple of business impacts, right? Carl, the security manager, this is where he has most of his concerns, right? So these 6 hours of outage means that we're going to lose £60,000 because we need to give service credits back to our customers. And we know that in a kind of typical scenario, not worst case scenario, but on a kind of a medium thing, is that we can potentially lose up to 7 contracts because we're going to be on the news. We're going to be, things will happen that relate to this loss. So if we do lose those 7 contracts over the next 3 years, we're talking about a potential net loss of £600 million, right? And this deals with the threat of not failure to meet contractual requirements. Just on this categorization alone, at least from my experience, I'm expecting a lot of you, I've had a conversation with a few people and they tend to agree with me. This type of metadata, just having this present across the chain would probably reduce the need for at least 5 or 6 meetings that people usually have around these things, because the risk manager will not necessarily understand the terms that the incident manager uses to describe a problem. Then the tech gal will probably talk about constraints and losses when the security manager is only interested about the business impacts, right? So just adding this type of metadata to the way we are managing our business systems and our governance systems already puts you a long, long way into enable effective communication without people having to be on committees and boards and conversations when they may not even have the necessary language to actually collaborate. Right? So this is another thing that I suggest, is using threat taxonomy as a categorization system to help bridge this gap. Another potential way to address a communication problem is adopting a cybersecurity style guide. So Bishop Fox is a consulting company based in the US where they've created this cybersecurity style guide specifically for researchers. Basically what it does is it gives us a way to think about and to normalize the language that we use in our organization. Again, if you're a security leader, that sometimes brings your security incident manager and your risk manager to talk to the board about risks, and you don't curate or normalize the language, they will probably be referring to the same things using different words, right? And that makes the overall issue of talking security much more difficult for everyone outside of the team to actually understand, right? And this is something, the cybersecurity style guide helps us normalize that. And it even comes with a dictionary that you can add to your Office suite. So when you're using some of these terms that can be potentially interpreted or used in different ways, that it gives us a better ability to then and there deal with the problem. So for instance, in order to normalize this language, if you're going to talk about a 0 day or O day in formal writing, you should prefer using 0 day finding, right? And make sure that this is how everyone adheres to. And this is a very big list, so we've got hundreds of terms that this style guide helps us normalize the language that we use. Not only that we should be doing it for our formal reports when we want to communicate security to the rest of the business, but also in terms of us internally, right? Again, we've got incident people with risk people trying to communicate with each other so that we can start normalizing on what we mean. And finally, with regards to the communication problem, so this is the last one that I'm going to be talking about with regards to the communication problem, is the cyber defense matrix. So this was developed by Sonil Yu. Another problem with security people is that we often get lost or deeply ingrained into technical jargon in complicated models or standards to discuss security things. And that hurts not only our communication with non-technical areas of security, like risk compliance and audits, but also with the wider organization, right? If we start getting too much into the technical jargon of why we need something, people will usually pay less attention, right? Because at the end of the day, they don't care about our security toys, they care about what it means to them, right? So I really like this cyber defense matrix to have a conversation about security, because it helps us address that complexity by very simply aligning the things I do, which is a reference to the NIST framework. So identify, protect, detect, respond, and recovery by things I care about, right? And that would be devices, applications, networks, data, and users. So a great insight on this is also that things early in the cycle, so identify and protect, tend to be more reliant on technology, and things further to the right will tend to be more reliant on people. So recovering and response is usually more of a people thing than a technology thing. Obviously, it plays a role on all of them. And this can be used for in a number of different purposes. So we can think about it in terms of looking at market segments, right? What solutions do I have, security solutions do I have in-house? What technical solutions do I have in-house that can potentially do some of these things already? So it's not necessarily just for security things, it's things that provide a security benefit. And think about how we're spending money, what solutions we have in place. Are we overlapping lots of different technologies that at the end of the day deal with the same type of problem, right? And without having this type of view, it becomes very easy to spend money on problems you should already have solved. So last time I checked, there were about 30 different use cases already identified to use the cyber defense matrix. These are some of the ones we can use it for. So to define security design patterns, we can use it to assess our landscape. So for instance, in our attack surface, so for instance, a serverless function will only be exposed to a few of these threat attack surfaces, then we'll full on DMZ, for instance. So thinking about what it is that I'm doing and how am I protecting it according to its need. Understanding our parameters, calculating our defense in depth. So do we have controls across all the spectrum? Are we can use this for budgeting. So am I spending more money on a particular side of things than on the other ones? Finding opportunities for automation, for instance, yeah, and a lot of different things, identifying gaps, people in technology. So there was kind of in terms of communication problem, those are some suggestions on how I think we can start using some methods, things that we already know about in security to help bridge this this communication problem within teams. So this is not about Wardley mapping and doctrine per se, right? This is more, let's use the things that we already know to address some of those doctrine as the methods to apply when doing some of those doctrine elements. Then we've got the engineering problem. So a big part of the engineering problem is that we often turn security standards into fads when we really should be focusing more on engineer and developer experience. Right? So we think a lot about we need these controls in place and not enough on what will this mean to the day-to-day work of my developers and my engineers, and if it's too hard, will they find easy ways around having to deal with these constraints? Right? And I think that's something that we don't often think about. Also, the bolt-on security vendor-driven security that we still have a lot of, and the VC funding model of cybersecurity companies doesn't help with that, but that's we'll talk about it soon. But this product-driven approach adds cost, adds complexity, and also promotes siloed thinking. Right? What I mean by that is that if we are doing security using specific security tools that are not integrated into the work that developers and engineers do, it will become much easier to justify for the engineering teams to say, it should not be my team doing that. You've got your own security team. That's a security thing. You do it. Right? So the fact that we're not integrating how we approach some of these things is reinforcing the silos that already exist. It also prevents agency from the technical teams. Right? So if it's not something that is deeply integrated into what they're doing, they will not feel a sense of agency over what security looks like, and security will always be someone else's problem. And this not only decreases resilience of our organizations, but also introduces business risk. And most organizations are still trying to secure cloud and architectures of microservices like we did on-prem and N+1 architectures. Right? And this is about coevolution of practices. Things have moved on and we need to move on with them. So understanding the engineering problems through looking at climate and climatic patterns. So components can co-evolve. That's one of the things. That's why DevOps came to be a thing. So the units of work are generally smaller now, right? Microservices, etc. So our approaches to security also need to be reflecting this. The co-evolved practices now mean that there's more agency by the devs over the things that they work on and what it looks like. Right? And generally, this is not how we're still approaching security. Right? And I think this is a big problem. Not only in terms of how we approach architectures, but in terms of the agency people expect to have. So if you've got a top-notch engineer who's used to, in a unicorn company, dealing with the security of their product, they join our team where we don't let him do anything, he's going to be not very happy with that approach, right? And we risk losing talent because we haven't adapted our ways of working. And the world is now declarative. Right. So most of the things that a lot of the things that we do on software side of things, they're going to be in code. right? Whether that's the application or the infrastructure, it's going to be code. In most governance in processes that we build around security things haven't really adopted to reflect that, right? But if the artifacts are now different, our approaches to security needs to stop being about committees and review boards. It needs to be about looking at the code and assessing what the code is going to do and the effects we expect from what the code says it will do. And this is about, again, co-evolution of practices. And also, there's no choice of evolution, right? So that climatic pattern says that we need to continuously adapt to keep still. Right? So the example that, the typical example is in early 80s, no one was using CRM. The people that were early adopters on CRM saw immense strategic advantage by going down that route because they could suddenly do many more things with data. In early 2000s, it was already a cost of doing business. Right? So if you were just starting, as with DevOps, right? If you were just as with DevOps now, if you were just starting your CRM transformation in early 2000s, you're just catching up, right? You can lie to yourself and say you're doing it for strategic advantage, but you're not, right? The market has already passed through that. At that point, you're only doing that to survive, not to attain strategic advantage. For us in security, we risk becoming bottlenecks alongside with the other gatekeepers, right? So it's not just the InfoSec, it's about typical service management, quality management. In the worst offenders, I really think it's finance, right? They expect us to have a CapEx code for everything that we do and not really understanding that enabling OpEx as an enabling constraint in organization gives you much more flexibility and much more possibility of development than keeping on saying, oh, you need to have a CapEx code for everything, right? That, yeah, people that have been working in the industry for more than 15 years, I think we all know how painful that is. So my experience with that type of thing in particular is in particular with big contracts like IBM contracts, etc. I usually saw senior stakeholders having conversations that took 2-3 weeks of many meetings to govern a change that would be a 15-minute operational change, right? So we spent about 3 days discussing something that is a 15-minute change, right? Even if hiding behind the guise of OpEx and CapEx, etc., that is not a good place to be in, right? That doesn't help the organization achieve anything. And our competitors are also likely to be adapting. We talked about it. And again, we'll struggle to retain talent if we keep doing things the old way, in the older way. Also, the competitors' actions will change the game. So we should not be thinking just of our immediate comfort. We need to think 5 years down the line. What does security spend look like 5 years down the line? Does security spend include that much capital investment? I don't think it does. Right, we'll talk about it next, and we need to start thinking about the cost of doing security and how that affects the whole thing. So being good at situational awareness also means that we can focus on enabling the business in integrating our approach, as opposed to buying all the vendors that Gartner tells us that we should be buying. So using Doctrine to talk about the engineering problem. So if you've got an old school team, this is not the time to speak. This is the time to learn, to listen. Right? So the things that we learned about, they are still valid to some extent, but we need to understand how they actually become operational in organizations with the new development patterns. And again, this is, I said, do you even Docker? But it's not just about Docker, right? It's about the patterns, the tools that we use. They're different now. Right? So what we should be thinking about is I'm not expecting security people to become Docker and Kubernetes experts if that's what our companies use, but I would be expecting us to do a 10-hour course on having some hands-on experience just to understand what it looks like. What does it smell like, right? When someone puts a code, what does it feel? I don't care that you are an expert, but I do care that you understand the basic language of the architecture of the thing. Because until we don't understand the basic architecture of the thing, we should not be trying to govern its security because we don't understand enough about the problem to actually govern it. And also we should be, if we've got a big team, let's cross-train. Some people will do training on Docker, others on Kubernetes, others on serverless, others on whatever. And then let's ensure that if we have an old school type team, that everyone's learning something and getting the opportunity to teach everyone else in the team to cross-train. right? And that in dedicating time in our security strategies just for getting people up to speed with the new development things. Otherwise, again, going back to the affordances thing I said at the beginning, pursuing strategies on securing all of these things when all of your team doesn't even understand the problems you're trying to fix or how operationally how things work, it's not a problem. The environment doesn't afford you that, right? So it's not a valid strategy until you actually understand the problem space. And I think that's a problem that many security teams are facing at the moment. And also we need to spend more time on, as part of this systematic mechanism of learning, we need to spend more time with our developers, asking for permission. Let us go spend a life in the day of an engineer. Let's watch them go through Gradle or Maven looking for a library. What would they do when they selecting library A over B? Let's when they start writing pieces of code, let's see them go to Stack Overflow and look for pieces of code that they can leverage. Let's really understand what are digital front lines, what their job looks like, right? So we can start then thinking, okay, now I understand the constraints, I understand the trade-offs. Now let's I'm now in the position to actually try and govern it and make it more secure. The other part is on using appropriate methods. Right? And going back to Wardley concepts, every time you introduce a new practice, it's going to be in Genesis. Right? So you need to ensure that you're not going to be saying, this is my practice and how it needs to be and now it's fixed. No, expect to fail. Expect that you're going to get it wrong. In the first 3 weeks, when someone's trying to do it, you'll probably see that what you did initially didn't even make sense, right? So let's think about how we're going to evolve, work with the business, work with other teams, so we can evolve these things over time. Also, on using appropriate methods, we need to stop thinking about gatekeeping and about guardrailing. There's a lot written on the subject, so I'm sure this will be familiar to most of us. And also, we need to get better at expressing what will make us trust more. Right? A big problem of gatekeeping is we don't trust the developers to do the right things, and we don't expect the process. We don't trust the process to give us what we need. Right? So let's think about what we need. Let's say, okay, I think you're going to choose an insecure library. Right? So if you were to always choose good libraries, then I would trust your approach more. Okay, so that then informs what should we do next. Let's introduce a dependency checker app. Right? So let's think not only about how we do good security, but let's think about what would make me trust the process more. Right? And start building requirements and defining our security transformation plans based on those things that will make us trust more. And the three things is avoiding anti-patterns, aiming for resilience, and learning from safety engineering. There's a lot on safety engineering that we can leverage and learn from. And also on tools, using appropriate tools. So the tools need to be in the hands of engineers and devs. So that's an expectation of modern development practices. Should we even be choosing those tools? I don't think we should, but that's going to be a big one. We'll get back to that in a minute. So another thing is when you choose tools, are we choosing tools that are ready for engineering agency, for the engineer's agency, and for CI/CD? So what I mean by this is that do those tools support automation, right? We have CLIs, we have APIs. Can we fail on findings? Can we export results? Do we allow developers to manage false positives in the code, right? As opposed to having to send a ticket or an email, oh, you need to whitelist this thing or whatever may be the case. So a lot of companies claiming that their tools are DevOps friendly, they don't do these things, right? So this is something that we need to be more conscious of. And also, as much as possible, we should use commodities and native capabilities as much as possible, for a couple of different reasons. The first one is the integration of work, right? And the other one is also about the spend, right? The great difference between the things that are in stage 3 in Wardley maps and stage 4 is feature differentiation when it comes to security tools. If we've got business processes that we can't engineer around, that we really need a specific feature to make happen in our own context, then that's the justification for having a security product. Go for it. That's the right thing. 8 times out of 10, you'll find that the commodity versions of those things give you everything that you need and even more, because you don't need to be thinking about updating servers, about patching apps. That's all done for you. Just consume a service from the cloud, right? And not only that, but in those companies, they've got dedicated teams just doing something that is very narrow, right? So the rate of evolution that what you would expect the evolution to be on a typical product company over 5 years, maybe your cloud provider can give you the same type of maturity within a year and a half, right? Because they've got resources that are completely dedicated just on that one narrow thing. Right? And this is what I mean by also no choice of revolution, and about the difference between the spend in security. So product-driven bolt-ons are very capex heavy, and many dinosaur companies still prefer this type of expenditure. But so in those types of companies, OPEX is a business curse word, right? You mention OPEX and everyone's on you because it's a big problem. Yeah, a lot of companies are coming to terms that having everyone on OPEX is a good enabling business constraint, right? And hopefully you'll start working for companies that are that forward-looking. But the big problem here is that with this move, the CISO budgets are also mutating, in that the unilateral decision-making for particular product or technology types is becoming less palatable. So the CISO 5 years down the line will not have the same amount of agency over choosing the security tools that they want as much as they do now, right? Because this needs to be integrated, because you can now consume commodities and you can have the billing integrated as part of a CTO and CIO budget. Right? So will no longer be a need for this big capital budgets for CISOs. But as with everything, there will be inertia, lots of it, because the professional CISOs are used to big capital budgets for transformation. They're used to making independent decisions. They're using to have these big teams that are doing all the security things, when the new design patterns require a much more integration of what that is. So we still need security leaders, but we need security people, but we need those to be focusing on the 20% that require the bulk of the expertise, and then working with the streamlined and the platform teams to put in their hands the agency for everything else. Right? And we need to stop treating security as rocket science, because it really isn't. Right? We need to get better at communicating and pushing things into the hands of other people. Another part on dealing with the engineering problem is start avoiding security anti-patterns. And the NCSC has some very good things with regards to this. So back-to-back firewalls is silly, right? I see a lot of companies still buying on the cloud, the virtual appliances, having a Cisco and the Checkpoint one. Don't, right? I hope this is not anyone feeling offended by this, but that's just silly, right? Everything is declarative. You've got it in code. You can go check and you can see the security for what it looks like. If you need to assure it, you can look in one piece of code and know exactly what it looks like. You don't need to be looking 2 or 3 different code bases and products, right? Let's leverage those things. Let's not make it more difficult than it needs to be. The other problem is on-prem, thinking on-prem and just doing lift and shift to the cloud, right? That's not helping. On the contrary, right? This is the type of pattern that is also an anti-pattern that a lot of security people still try to force. The other part is on management bypass, right? So people having access to a particular jump box and then having access to everything that is behind it, right? And that's another bad thing, because if you get an account compromised, then you potentially expose all of your crown jewels. So these are all some anti-patterns that I would suggest everyone reads the NCSC document that has very good guidance. And this is my preferred quote on all type security approaches that I've ever seen, right, by Professor Barry Horowitz. So I'm going to read, right? I think it's that important. When you ask an engineer to make your boat go faster, you get the trade space. You can get a bigger engine, but give up space in the bunk next to the engine. You can change the hull shape, but that'll affect your draw. You can give up some weight, but that'll affect your stability. When you ask an engineer to make your system more secure, they pull out the pen and pencil and start making lists of bolt-on technology. Then they tell you how much it's going to cost. Right? And this is overall a problem of how to approach engineering in security. So another field that is really maturing in its application to software engineering is resilience engineering. So there are a lot of misconceptions about what resilience is, particularly in software. It's something that our organization, not the software, does, right? It's not something that it has. So resilience is not SRE, it's not DevOps, it's not chaos engineering, it's not automation, right? And it's not a synonym for redundancy, for robustness, for high availability, for fault tolerance, right? Or anything about software or hardware, right? Resilience is a sustained adaptive capacity or the continuous adaptability to unforeseen situations. So it's and in order to do this, it's a complete step change from how we typically approach security in organizations, right? Where we tend to think about, I need this control, I need that control. But no, this is about organizational resilience, right? When something happens, do we have mechanisms of learning in place to actually learn from it? So do we understand not only what went well, but also why didn't it go worse, right? The usual thing of saying not throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? So there are some things that work. Let's think about how our system organization is adapting to increase demands, to the development of the threat landscape, into how we approach the business of development, right? Which is not just about the developers and the engineers. It's not just about security. It's also about procurement. It's also about finance. It's also about all those things that play a role in constraining how we approach security. And so those two slides, links. The first one is a talk about John Allspaw on what resilience engineering is. And the second one, lots and lots of resources on resilience engineering that I would suggest everyone reads. A few of them, they're really good stuff. So Kelly Shortridge, the VP at Capsulate of product security. She has some great stuff on how applied resilience in security as well. And she wrote this blog post and a few other ones that are more lengthy that I would suggest everyone to read as well. So robustness, she says that resilience in security is about three things. It's about robustness, so withstanding and resisting a negative event, about adaptability, so managing our current system response to negative events. So this is about minimizing event impact, optimizing for system recovery, how fast can we recover and understand what happened, and also to minimize friction on the things involved in changing our systems, right? So if you've got lots of gates and committee boards, etc., that's not adaptability, right? That's the opposite of adaptability. And finally, transformability. So our ability to reorganize in response to updated assumptions, right? So the example that she gives on that particular blog post is using PHP as an example, right? So robustness would be about us creating a web application firewall rule to prevent the exploitation of the vulnerability and then patching that instance, right? So that's making our system more robust. Adaptability would be about removing the inline queries from the application and replace it with a class that accesses the database and does all the sanitization stuff. Right? And finally, transformability would be our ability to re-architect the application using a different language, right? Because we know PHP has a lot of security problems, and moving on to a different language that doesn't have as much inherent security problems, right? So those are the three things that we need to learn more about as a function. These are also both resilience engineering and this resilience stuff is emerging patterns, but there are things that are now ramping up in adoption, and we would do well to look into these to think about how to do security. There's also a lot that we can learn from safety engineering, right? So this is from Nancy Leifson in the book she has called Engineering a Safer World. A big part of our problem in designing for security is that we concentrate too much on the screen in and not enough on screen out, right? And we keep thinking about users being outside of the system when they're not. Right? So as Nancy Leifson says, a system that fails on user action is a system in need of redesign. Right? And this is not just about the users of the system, this is about the actions of the privileged users. Right? If a privileged user is suddenly taking a massive database of 10 million records when we don't expect that to be done, the system should be intelligent enough to understand that there's something happening that shouldn't and apply control action based on that. Right? So I think and we really need to start thinking about giving enough attention to the integrated system as a whole. And we haven't been doing that, generally speaking. We still tend to think about the users being sometimes a bit silly. They don't care about security. They just click all the links, right? We need really, that should be what's informing that we're not taking the right approach to designing the system, so it doesn't, so it can withstand these types of approaches. And both safety and security are emergent properties, right? And we need to start thinking of them as such, right? So the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And that's why we can learn a lot from it, is because they're both emergent properties. So STEMP stands for Systems Theoretic Accident Modeling Processes, and it's about understanding that accidents are caused by inadequate control. Right? And STPI, which is it's about finding the inadequate controls in a design. So if a user does something or a privileged user does something else, and are we suddenly exposed to conditions with no other options other than catastrophic breach or system failure? Right. And when you start thinking about these in an integrated way, so what's the controller, what's the control process, what can happen when someone does something, and what effect does that have on the system, then we start having a better ability to look at the wider thing. Personally, these things are things that have been written about for at least 10, 15 years now, a lot of these things on safety engineering, but there was a particular problem with the security solutions that I think personally that were preventing us from having the ability to do this integrated view and apply a lot of this learning to security, which is the fact that we were reliant on an industry based on security products. And security products have both actuators and sensors which are proprietary. Right? And because we have an AV that does something, the SIM that does something else, and they all have its own actuators and sensors to do things, we weren't in the position to actually have an integrated approach to all of these, right? Because it was always things from different vendor ecosystems that we had to integrate, and that's a really hard piece of engineering. With the adoption of cloud commodities, suddenly that's no longer such a big issue, because we can leverage what comes out of CloudTrail, of whatever solutions that we have, and actually start having an ecosystem that if I see this type of vlogging message being done, then I know that this thing happened, and now I can create a function, a serverless function that triggers this, right, instead. And I think the conditions are now met that we're going to be in the position to leverage a lot of these learnings into how we approach cybersecurity. And that was it on the engineering problem. On time, yeah, halfway through it. Yeah, I think I'm good for time. The management problem is, I want to go back to, there's a lot of the management problem that also relates to the engineering problem, particularly on budgets, etc. So we're going to probably go to discuss that a bit again as well. But the first one is the millionaire CISO budgets has made it commonplace and acceptable to overspend on security. Right? Everyone, especially in big companies, you will have potentially everything from 2 million up to 500 million yearly budget to the security, right? And this has made it commonplace, and people are already expecting to turn around technology every 2-3 years, and it's commonplace to overspend. The short tenors from CISOs implies a lack of skin in the game and preference for short-term minded decision-making, right? Again, if we go back to the idea of time spans of discretion that I introduced earlier, if we know that there takes a time for us to understand the impact of our actions, 2 years, I think the last I seen was the average CISO tenure to be 18 months to 20 months. That's not enough time for something at the risk management layer to materialize, right? So if that is the regular time that we've got CISOs in their roles, it will not be enough time for them to see the consequences of the decisions they're making. And also, modern development practices requires more strategic focus on providing agency to others, as opposed to the empire building that we've done for the last decade, right? So saying I need more people in the security team, etc. That may not be the right thing to do. So, for instance, with one of the customers that I'm currently working with, they said, okay, so you need now 2 security engineers to do a particular stuff we're thinking about doing from a DevSecOps perspective. And my answer was, no, don't get security people, right? We know what the work needs to be. You should get two DevSecOps engineers, two DevOps engineers that already have an interest in knowledge of applying security stuff. And let's think that they need to spend 60–70% of their time doing security stuff. And then the other 30% they can use to do other stuff that you need to get done, right? But this is a step change from I need more people to do more security, right? This is more, and we'll get back to that in a minute. So, and also the security programs have over-relied on self-assessment and needs, and not on enough on taking advantage of business affordances, right? And this is another thing that I propose that as an industry change, is that we should not be setting security strategy before we've seen the strategy of all of the areas of the business, right? Because why? Because if HR is going to define a plan of what they want to do for next year, then we should look into that to know what affordances we're going to be given to improve security too. And if we're just blindly trying to do security that based on what we think we should be doing in that particular area, we will miss opportunities of taking advantages of these affordances that other business transformation can give us. Right. So we need to get better at understanding what are the strategies of other parts of the organization, so we can tap into what they're doing and make change happen within the affordances that of what's already going to happen anyway, whether we are present doing it securely or not. And finally, qualitative only approaches to managing risk are bias on a matrix. Right. So having a qualitative only approach in the 5x4 type matrices, etc., that's not something that we should be doing in 2020. There are much better ways of doing that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So this again using concepts by J. Bloom, between doing a cause and seeing an effect, there's a temporal, there's a time that goes through them. If for a knowledge worker, that can be a commit, or that can be a few sprints. If for an exec, that could be a couple of years, right? So for security leaders, most CISOs don't actually get to see the effects of the decisions if we agree that the typical time span is 18 to 20 months where they're seeing. And this is a problem because a new CISO will then come in, he will come with a potentially different way of doing things, and we're making decisions, never seeing the impact of what the previous decisions were. Right, and it's decisions on top of decisions without actual observability on the effects that the previous decisions had. So understanding this through climate. So this is mostly about inertia, right? So success breeds inertia. So relationships with vendors and integrators will hold you back, right? So most security companies will have preferred relationships with particular security vendors, with particular integrators that do their security for them. In the relationships and all of the perks that we get from those relationships will cause inertia from the security leaders to actually make different decisions and adopting commoditized versions of security. Familiarity with how to engineer and support in the support models will also make this more complex, right? So people are used to they spend 5 minutes trying to solve a problem. If it doesn't work, you open a support ticket and let the vendor deal with that. Right? The type of integration of things no longer afford you that type of challenge. So people need to be more comfortable in failing and learning from failure and keeping that knowledge in-house so that we can improve the resilience of our organization overall. And we need to learn to let go, right? Just because it has security on a name, it doesn't mean a security person needs to be in the room at all times, right? And that's also something that is there's going to have some inertia, because in the past, 20 years ago, that's how you did security. That's what good security looked like, right? But not anymore. And also, inertia increases the more successful the past model is. So you're going to have more resistance and bias when you attempt to change these things. So the command and control gatekeeper approach is no longer what organizations need. And we need to stop measuring ourselves and the security leaders and our peers on how big our capital budget is or how big our team size is, right? And we're going to talk about that next as well. So it's not just, and also, it's not just about the role that you're doing now, right? So when, as a security leader, we go into the next organization, and we get to the next employer, do we have the skills that they require to be successful? Or do they need different skills that we're not qualified to perform? Right? We need to understand not only what it means to our comfort right now, but if we go into a different organization that already adapted a lot of these things, will it be completely foreign to me, or will I have built the knowledge that I need to govern it appropriately, right? And in line with the new ways of doing things. And using Doctrine on this management problem, there's a lot of elements that we can tap into. So the first one is be pragmatic. So the way I've seen Simon talk about it is, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, right? That's a thing that we need to be focusing on, catching the mice, not if it's the cat is black or white. So we need to ensure that the job is being done, not who is doing it, right? We need to start caring less about who's doing the job, as long as it's getting done. And our knowledge may also be inadequate, right? So let's just understand that that may be the situation. Let's train our teams. Let's give them the space they need to actually update their skills. We also need to think fast, inexpensive, restrained, and elegant. So we should stop committing millionaire budgets up front, right? And start thinking about an iterative way of approaching security, right? Let's give a few £1,000s to a different product teams and say, okay, we need to now do this type of capability, and for you to take ownership of it, right? Test it, tell us what you think, what would make it better, does it work for you, right? And not think, okay, let's give 300K in licensing for the next 2 years to this particular vendor, without knowing if we can actually adapt not only the meanings, the know-hows, and the actual materials in the accommodate within our development process, without significant constraints or trade-offs that we may not be able to see it now, that we could only see after people actually start using them. Right? And this is also a lot on how security teams tend to overspend and spend money on a lot of stuff that ends up not being effective, right? Because we make big deals in advance because we are expecting to save 15 or 20% of budget because we did a multi-year thing, when actually the way the things work and the practices that need to co-evolve to use the tool, that we don't actually have the affordances to make them happen, right? And then we would be spending a lot of money without having any actual return. Or worse yet, then say that the problem is the teams, right? When it's not the teams, it's that we didn't consider the complexity of integrating the tool into the development practices and the culture of the organization. And we should start with open source, right? Maybe we don't need more. If we want to do dependency checking, etc., let's start with open source, see if we can adapt the practices and have people actually pay attention. And then when we find something that open source can't help us achieve, then let's figure out the other options, right? But first, thinking inexpensive, let's just getting some visibility and some traceability. That's the key thing. And if we're thinking CI/CD, use Docker for security testing, right? Stop suggesting people need to install all the things, etc. We can use Docker with one command. We can copy paste a command that people can integrate into their pipelines and start having immediate visibility of some security tests. Also, effectiveness over efficiency, right? So don't waste time making the ineffective more efficient, right? So understanding landscape first and before we optimize for flow. So Simon usually talks about the best example that I like is the weighing machine that he mentioned this morning as well, right? Where they were trying to make something more efficient when actually the whole thing needed to go, right? It's just a SQL query. Right? We need to start thinking more about evolutionary versus process flow into how we integrate security. And we also need to delegate, find secure ways to stop being in the way, right? And with that, it doesn't mean that we are going to be irresponsible. Let's spot audit instead. Let's just make sure that we're not in the space of learning, right? And the continuous feedback loops that developers could be learning from, and thus doing that instead. Let's find a way to do spot audits instead, outside of the loop, so that we can help them build their that knowledge and achieve that resilience. And also we need to think about a pattern to go through, right? At first we need to collaborate to build capability, then we need to facilitate, so not doing, but teaching people how to do, and then we need to get out of the way and manage outputs, right? And providing a silent service, ideally. And finally, two other elements of doctrine that are relevant is managing inertia. So understanding the root cause of inertia to change. So it can be practices, power structures, previous investment, political capital, and other things. And also having a bias towards the new, right? So starting to experiment and take the opportunity to collaborate in parallel with multiple teams, right? So we can make better choices based on the constraints of our organizational reality, okay, in the culture that we face. So inertia due to success of past model. So if you haven't seen this talk by Sonil Yu, I would highly recommend. I think generally we're still too hung up on our CIAs, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And I'm not arguing that we should dismiss them. I don't think we shouldn't, that we should. But I am arguing that as design principles, we should adopt ones that are more suited to be absorbed and consumed by the current design patterns, right? Which are knowing that the new design patterns are giving us unprecedented levels of resilience when compared to our old on-prem models, which was how CIA came to be. Right? So what he talks about in that talk is that if we're building distributed architectures, should we really be thinking about availability of single systems? Maybe not. If we've got declarative definitions of all the elements of our applications and infrastructure, do we really need to be thinking about file integrity monitoring systems and the integrity mechanisms? Instead, would we not be better thinking how we can leverage the immutability of the infrastructure and of the things that we're doing to prove and comply with our integrity requirements? And finally, if we're designing for ephemerality, so making our systems short-lived through orchestration, and even adopting serverless architectures and making attacker persistence incredibly challenging, right? If I only have a VM available for 5 minutes, should I be spending 10 minutes securing it? Maybe not, right? So it's not that the CIA is wrong, right? It's that if we're going to change the patterns, we need to change language, because language is important. And until we get new language, we're going to get hung up on old ways of doing things. Right? And so this change isn't groundbreaking, but I think that changing our language is a required step to change our worldviews and mental models, right? And start having more targeted conversations between engineers and security that if we just keep talking CIA, that we're probably not going to get, right? Because people are still hearing the words that they were hearing 10 years ago, so they don't think that we're changing the way we approach things if we keep on using the same language. And it's also about meeting our stakeholders where they are, right? So this is again Jay Bloom work that I adapt to security. If we're coming from a point of view of gatekeepers, right, we need to consider the current worldviews of stakeholders. We understand what's preferable in the worldviews. So if we, in a true gatekeeping fashion, if a gatekeeper could get away with it, he would do an external code review and a pen test for every change. Right? That's what he would do, because that's potentially the model that he's bringing to the table at the moment, because that's how we did good security in a waterfall, all the SDLC, traditional SDLC type approach, right? So if we're going to help them move to new ways of thinking about security, we need to think what's within something that is plausible, that they see, that they understand is something that they can live with. If we go straight into saying, let's do chaos engineering and break our production systems, he's going to tell them, no, you need to go away because you're irresponsible, right? We don't get there in a week. We're going to have to build this trust in teams and process. In doing that may mean that we first focus on threat modeling and policy as code. Let's check our cookies. Let's check our easy things that we can do with policy as code, that we can start building the trust by the gatekeepers on how they can integrate some of these practices to benefit from early feedback loops and provide early visibility to the developers. And over time, we iterate and we think about, now that your worldview sees as preferable a number of activities and approaches, what's the next step, right? And do this iteratively and help the teams develop our approaches that way. The other part is on managing complex problems, right? And understanding that our organizations are complex adaptive systems. So I'm doing a talk on Cynefin this Friday. So if anyone wants to attend, you're very welcome. I'd like to get feedback on that. This is what is called the domain model for complex, for the complex domain. And we need to get better equipped with tools to help us manage in complexity, right? Because it gives us a great set of ways to perform this management. Remember that this is from the point of view of the decision maker. That's what Cynefin is about. So I don't think most of the time this should be the CISO, but that's probably another rant that we are not going to get time to get into today. But whenever we have multiple coherent hypotheses of what the decision makers should do and not enough time to fully analyze all of them, then we should aim to do multiple safe to fail experiments, right? Where in that we can try different approaches to solve a particular problem. So the decision maker can then validate and understand the unintended consequences, because there will always be unintended consequences. And the one thing that I think this domain model is particularly relevant to how we approach security, because I think in trying to adopt new ways of working in security, we will often find ourselves at the edges of the diamond, right? If we get groupthink, so everyone, for instance, we've got a security team that is entirely dismissive of DevOps in general, right? They think people are just gonna get it wrong, that you're gonna be breached after a month, as being responsible and problematic. There are two ways of trying to, and they may even try to sabotage DevOps initiatives, right? I've seen that happen, right? Because they just don't believe that that's the right thing to do. We may find ourselves, and if this is completely ingrained in how people think about security, we've got two ways of potentially doing this. One of them is potentially break it up fast. This may mean even making your whole security team redundant. Sorry for suggesting it, but in some cases that may be the strategic thing to do. Another approach is to challenge their evidence, right? So that old school teams are holding on to. So what we can do is find ways to challenge this evidence. And this is where I think books or knowledge that we get from Team Topologies book by Manuel Pais and Matthew Skelton. So I just did 2 hours ago a joint session with Manuel Pais on Team Topologies on applying these things to cybersecurity. The book Accelerate by Gene Kim and Nicole Forsgren, and the Phoenix Project by Gene Kim as well, alongside the DevOps Handbook. So let's grab those books, let's figure out what the problems they were trying to solve and how they've solved it, and let's use that as challenging the evidence that people may be holding on to justify keeping things the way they were. Right? Let's make workshops around the content. Let's get people half a day every day to go through the content of these books and challenge the evidence that they think they have on why those are not good ideas, right? And then we may be ready to fully exploit integration of security. It may also be that we've got one or two people in the team that are heretics or mavericks. So they already know that this is the right thing to do, but they're not necessarily sharing it with the rest of the team, right? Or helping others get on board onto that. So here, what we can do is either have them do coaching and meditation, right? Or otherwise, we can think of a few security initiatives or a few projects that can be done to kind of prove the concepts before we think of it as being ready to be exploited. This is one of the ways of applying these concepts of managing in complexity. So another aspect that we can learn a lot from safety too, and this is application of resilience engineering to compliance work in safety, is that it's this model. So what isn't working, which is the centralized mode of control and approach to compliance. So we as security professionals, we develop our policies and plans as to how we manage the work and how we think the work should be performed based on all of the uncontextualized best practices. So the first point of tension happens here, right? When the ones affected by the policies internalize that the policy statements do not match the reality of how the work gets done or what it takes to get the work done, right? So the policies are then discounted, right, by the ones that are affected by them. And some of the contradictions and challenges to make stuff work are smoothed out. So that's what it's meant by fluency. And no one gets any wiser about the emergent challenges in meeting policy. Right? Whatever the current situation is, it's rationalized as being appropriate because this is how we do things. Right? But the problems then arise, what are called the double binds, as the frontline workers in the security pros face irreconcilable decisions between two simultaneously necessary but incompatible choices. Right? And this is where tension and conflict happens. So it's the difference between work as imagined and the work as actually done. Right? And one of two things can happen. Either people go into role retreat, and that's akin to being yes people. So it undermines collaboration. People just do it and don't pay any attention on why they do it, and that's bad. Or it leads to covert work systems, in that work is hidden by the frontline teams, afraid that it will be stopped or changed, and that widens the gap between work as imagined and work as done. Right? And the more there's a discrepancy between work as imagined and work as done, the greater the effort will go to keeping those practices hidden, whilst providing the proverbial lip service to the compliance requirements. Right? And this style of approach decreases collaboration between teams that should be supporting each other. In applying this to security compliance, it doesn't help that a lot of compliance teams end up having an approach of being more audit management in managing the ISO 27001 certification cycle. And so you only really hear about them once a year when they're with a pen and paper to checklist and see what you've done in the past year. Right? This was not working in safety, and this is not working in compliance. And unfortunately, I think this is still how much companies approach the issue of security compliance. What is working, and that's what this paper that I pointed out to talks about, is how to have an approach instead of centralized control to guided adaptability. Right? So this starts in a similar way, right? So someone has a plan. In their existing strategies and plans should be applied to the activities. However, to an insider, this may not match the reality of how the work gets done. Right? So on fluency, it's about the work as done, which smooths over those contradictions and challenges. Though to an outsider, it may look that it's well articulated. Right? And this is the challenge with security compliance, is that for an auditor, it may seem that everything is all right when it actually isn't, right? Just because of the nature of the audit work. So the revision part is key in that when using, that's where using emerging and current information, we can revisit the models of risk and organization patterns of action so we can continually shape, change the shape of risk and operations, right? But these may operate in different time spans, right? As we talked about previously. Keeping pace is about continually matching the resources made available, the activities and responses, to the changing nature and tempo of the demands faced by the organization. Right? So we need to think about this from, again, from a resilience engineering point of view. There needs to be bandwidth available, the adaptive capability. Okay, there needs to be slack that it can be used for these types of activities, right, on both sides. Yeah, and so having flexible and available budgets is going to be key to actually make this happen. Reciprocity is about how well we coordinate activities that create ongoing exchanges for mutual benefits. Okay, so it's about enabling effective communications and feedback loops between compliance and the front lines, and making sure that they're continuously meeting the needs and the expectations of the other party. Right? And all of this rests on initiative. So going back to what we've talked about previously, the sense of agency by the people in the front lines, right, which is key to all of this, where I think centrally managed budgets and allocations make this less effective, right? In that the front lines and developers should have the budget made available to them so that they can use to address some of the compliance problems that they face or they find, right, and that are emergent. So this is a much better model, in my opinion, but we need to acknowledge that it changes all the product-based approaches, compliance and risk management approaches that we have in organizations. It changes the work and agency that developers have on security matters. And it changes also security budgets in the way we approach them. Right? And all of those we need to change for this type of model to actually be introduced, and compliance in the front lines actually be mutually supportive areas, and not get into the pattern of getting covert work systems where people are just trying to avoid doing compliance. And finally, we have the skills and structure problem. So static org chart thinking enacts significant barriers to communication with product and platform teams. We cannot pragmatically expect all engineers and developers to become security experts, so we need to design for cognitive load. Our security teams may not have the skills we need to be successful over the next decade, and we need to stop trying to find unicorns. Right? We need to be able to train for the skills that we require to be successful in our context. Right? So to understand that we need to go get people on the market, on the job market, and we need to have internally the learning mechanisms to make them effective at their work in our context, right? And not expect to get unicorns that can do all the things. And we also need to understand how we can leverage the current skills that we have and work within those constraints within adjacent possibles. That's what we're going to be looking about next. So using climate again, so components can co-evolve. So it's not just the tech that changed, the social practices and governance patterns did too. So things such as threat modeling and the way we manage the SDLC and we do peer reviews. It's no longer by having a couple of review boards and talking with people. It's now potentially on making a couple of settings on GitHub. Right, and having a way to spot audit that every once in a while. So organization charts is also killing us, and it will keep us there permanently if we don't do something about it. Again, no choice over evolution. So the command and control gatekeeper approach is no longer what we need. We need to design for agility and agency because our businesses can no longer afford to choose between quality and speed. And this is something that is very well depicted in the DevOps Handbook and some of those other books, and Accelerate. Those are the books that I've mentioned. We need to be a learning organization, or a competition will. And finally, it's about creative destruction. So creative destruction is the combination of inertia, punctuated equilibrium, which is when we have changes particularly from product to commodities. We tend to see a fast change following that. So there's usually a rapid destruction of the past, so the business models and practices, along with the creation of new ones. Right? So the business example would be if you were a car maker before Ford, you had a certain way of approaching the issue of building cars, and you had certain skills and know-hows. After Ford, there was a very condensed time period where your skills were going to no longer be relevant, and no one was going to spend any money on you, because those are no longer the skills that you need. Right? So it's the change from something being more custom-built product type thing to commodity usually sees a rapid change in how we approach things. And I think that's where security is at the moment, with the move from product-led to commodity consumption. So we've got two choices. We can either adapt and learn for ourselves, or wait for the business to bring someone else that will do it for us. And then we're going to have two problems. Not only will we not have a job, but we will also not have the skills that the market now requires of security people. But so now, so the right time to start getting acquainted with these changes was 5 years ago. Now is also okay, right? But probably not tomorrow. So the good news is that old school InfoSec teams, what they know is still valid, right? So we need to learn how to leverage. It's not a complete send it to the bin. There's things we can leverage. So let's think how we can leverage and learn the new skills in order to make us effective for the next decade. And the market is slowly eroding the need for legacy security skills. What I mean by that is that if all we're bringing to the table from a compliance point of view, for instance, is kind of checking boxes and doing evidence reviews, etc., it will be very soon that that's no longer what the market requires, right? If that's all that we bring to the table, then the market will potentially not need us in a kind of a short amount of time. So what I usually say is, if a security team for a compliance team, if they are requiring to, if they have the headcount to bring more people in, I'm usually telling my customers, bring in a QA engineer or a software developer that has an interest in security. Right? In that way, at least you can, because it's much easier to teach someone like that compliance than it is to teach someone that is that has been a compliance professional for 20 years that they should now start thinking about writing user stories or writing scenario testings or even writing compliance as code checks. Right? It's a much easier conversation to have the other way around. And on using climate, this is about focusing on user needs. So we need to understand the different levels of the organization we're providing services to. So the execs, the VP and directors and the knowledge workers, and to understand what they need from us. In their preferences and requirements should serve as our constraints. Generally speaking, it won't always be possible, but when it is, we should always consider their preferences and their requirements as constraints into how we can approach security to do something. Right? This is also about distributing power and decision-making. So less checklists and processes and more heuristics and rituals. We need to move away from having to be in the loop. And we can only do that, not by making everyone a security expert, because some of them are already managing code bases with two or three different programming languages. That's already hard enough. We need to develop more heuristics and rituals so that people can adopt some of these practices. And knowledge is power, so we need to educate but don't overwhelm. We need to be more deliberate in product level support as opposed to organizational objectives. Right? And this is where kind of the rubber hits the road, in my opinion. There's a lot of compliance is done mostly at the organizational level, and what that implies is that it becomes abstract to product teams. Right? The more we can integrate the thinking about security at the product teams, the more we can make it relevant to their scope in their context. Right? And I think that over time, we will reap the benefits of taking that approach. So the product owners need to be our allies, right? And we need to foster those relationships. And we also need to aim for a level playing field. What I mean by that is that when I go into consulting with customers, I usually go talk with devs and engineers, and they're going to tell me 10 or 15 things that aren't working. There are bad security things that they know about, right? Or vulnerabilities. I go to Jira and I don't see them there. Right? I see their bugs, I see all their improvement work, but I don't see the security stuff that's in their heads. And usually that's how I frame security to product owners. I don't want you to prioritize all of the security things and fix them tomorrow. I just want to level the playing field, add us to the backlog. Right? Let's talk with the teams about what security problems they already know they have, and let's add them to the backlog. Right? Let's level the playing field. And we also need to think about aptitude and attitude. So not pioneer settlers town planners, you're not ready for that. If you haven't done more than 10% of what I've mentioned throughout my presentation, if you haven't done it, you're not ready for pioneer settlers and town planners. So don't do that, please. We need to also focus on acquiring skills that we require to be successful. So if we're hiring new, thinking about Dev QA, for instance, and we need more diversity. We really, really need more diversity. Right? There's too much inbreeding. I think it's probably too strong of a word, but I can think of a better one. We have too much inbreeding in security. Security is still pretty much old white man type thing. We need diverse types of thinking. We need people with different types of background. We really need to open our field to different perspectives. When thinking about the structure problem, we need to think about Conway's law is a good way to think about it. So Conway's law says that organizations design systems which are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. Right? I really like Ruth Mellon's corollary to this. which says if the architecture of the system and the architecture of the organization are at odds, the architecture of the organization wins. Okay, what I hear from that is, if you've got a compliance and risk teams that have significant barriers of communication with the organization, I can tell you straight up, because of Conway's law, that that's going to be an organization that is very poor at managing risks and very poor at building compliant code and compliance systems, right? Because these communication structures will reflect the deliverables. And if we can't communicate, if we don't have the shared language, if we didn't address the communication challenge that I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to see the negative effects of this. So our organizational chart is holding us back here, right? And for most security teams, we would do well in going back to basics, which is you can only provide effective services when it's self-explanatory and clear what it is that you're trying to achieve, right? When people don't have, either through metadata or through communication, an understanding of what it means to them, of what security means to them in their context, then just thinking you can provide them something as a service is not going to work, because the base level of communication isn't there to make that effective. So when that is the case, we should go back into kind of stage one of team evolution, and that's collaboration. And in this collaboration between governance teams and engineering, we should be thinking about collaboration. So metadata management, so governance mapping, what this activity in your SDLC means to my activity when managing risks, for instance. We should be thinking about potentially doing some joint threat modeling and risk assessments, so that some of the teams can have a bit more of an understanding, of an appreciation of what it takes to get both parts of the job done. And we should focus first on visibility and reporting. So this is about adding stuff to backlog in Jira. It's about building automated reports in Confluence based on Jira data, for instance, that will give the visibility and reporting at the right level of the organization. It's developing ways of running a dependency checking tool or static code analysis tool, and making sure that the outputs of those tools make it as tickets in the Jira backlog. Right? It's working on those types of things in a collaborative fashion. And this is likely to require changes to the way you're approaching governance, risk, and compliance, right? And whatever management system you use to do that. Then it's about facilitation. So stopping to do things for other people, but focusing on cross-stream training and contextual guidance. Right? So at this part, we should be doing more boundary spanning, right? We tell people what to do, not do it for them or tell them what they need to be doing. And finally, we've got something as a service. So here we've got fully defined interfaces. So we can potentially have Jenkins library wrappers around our security tests, and the developers can just consume that library and use that library without even knowing what's under the hood, okay? At this point, we would have informed and supportive roadmaps. Right? So I'm doing my security roadmap not based on what I think the security is, but on the actual needs that I've identified, working together and having conversations with the product and development teams. And at this point, we should mostly be doing exception management, right? And not so much the kind of hand-holding or complete collaboration that is required in further evolved approaches. And finally, we need to think about being a learning organization. And I use this in the way Andrew Clay Schaffer refers to it, which is, he says, learning organizations become graduate studies in the skills they require to be successful. And this is a big problem in organizations overall, but also for security teams, in that we need to stop avoiding our responsibility as employers and understand that it's up to us to build the necessary learning materials and practices and rituals that will provide us, the organization, with the skills that we require to be secure, to be successful doing security. Right? And this is about strategic advantage or being left behind if our competitors learn how to do this before we do. And finally, it's about creative destruction, right? And how we can think about creative destruction in our context. But with a pinch of leverage. Again, not about saying security people are completely inadequate now. That's not the case. I don't think that's the case. It's about what there are new ways of doing things. What can I leverage that I already know to help me down the path of getting to be completely fluent in these new ways of doing things. So if you can secure traditional SLC, then you should learn about Agile and Scrum, really know it, right? Not just hear about what people talk about it, really know what the practice is. Then that will put you in a good position to understand DevOps, and that will then put you in a position to understand how to introduce security in DevOps, right? This is going to take time. Don't assume that you're going to read an article on Google and know about this, right? You need to spend some time potentially reading DevOps Handbook, reading the Phoenix Project, those kinds of things. It's going to be iterative and it's going to take time because things work differently. If you're used to doing requirements as spreadsheets that we send around in the checklist formatted stuff, then after you know Agile, then you should learn how to write a user story. You should then be in the position to write a good scenario testing. And then that should put you in a good position to start writing your first compliance as code tests, right? Checking simple stuff such as cookies. I also have a talk on compliance as code using Inspect for some of these things. If you can only do qualitative risk management, then go read about FAIR, factor analysis for information risk. You don't even need to change how you approach risk management. Start thinking about how you can do the risk analysis part to feed into a qualitative approach, right? Then, after you become fluent in having more quantitative approaches to the risk analysis, then you can completely change your framework and go to fully adopt something like FAIR, okay? But again, you can do this iteratively. You don't need to just send everything to the bin. You can leverage what you already know. Then if you can do a risk analysis, you can learn about threat modeling. If you can learn about threat modeling, maybe you can learn about threat modeling as code. And again, security products, cloud capabilities. If you know one, you can learn about the other one. You just need to dedicate time to actually learn about it. And if you know how to do CIA type robust engineering, you can also learn about doing DIE type resilience engineering, right? And whatever else it comes with it. It's a big area. But these are all things that are available to us, right? We just need to A, understand that it's going to take time, and B, appreciate that it's necessary. It's required because the things are changing and we need to evolve with them. I really like this Deming quote. Change is not necessary because survival is not mandatory, right? But if someone is not going to survive, I would rather be someone else than me, basically. So, kind of wrapping up, what we have here is if we can solve cybersecurity in our organizations in the next 5 years, and I think we can. And by solving, I don't mean solving as no breach will ever happen again. I mean solving as Sonil Yu mentions, solving as in-car safety. Right? We know there are problems are still going to happen, but largely we understand what it takes to get the problem addressed. Okay? So we talked about the communications problem and how we can potentially use subset, threat taxonomy, style guides, and the cyber defense matrix to help with the communications problem. We talked about the engineering problem, how we talked about a few anti-patterns, how we can talk about, learn about resilience engineering, how we can learn from safety engineering too, and how we need to be less gatekeeping and more guardrailing with active listening. We've talked about the management problem, how we need to be smarter about our spend and start thinking about decreasing the number of security suppliers that we have, how we apply doctrine, how we address sources of inertia, and how we can need to start taking risks in the experiment in managing in complexity. And finally, we looked about skills in the structure problem and how we need more dynamic and fluid team structures that can be highly collaborative with one particular team and then 3 months down the line pass to a service and be more collaborative with another team and have this type of more fluid approach and not org chart fixed type thinking. We talked about how to be a learning organization, how to hire for aptitude and attitude and the different options that we may have, and also how to leverage the existing skills but deliberately evolve them. Right? And this is my opinion about the 4 big security problems for the next decade that are affecting all of us, in some of the ways that we can potentially address them. I'm sure there are other ideas and other ways to approach these problems. These are some that I think are useful and are particularly relevant. And I'd welcome feedback. And also I'd like to put this on GitHub so more people can contribute with their own ways of applying doctrine or climatic patterns to some of these challenges. So Wardley mapping, in this instance, you've noticed we didn't look at a single map, right? So this was Wardley mapping as shared language for meaningful conversations, right? And even if you don't do Wardley map as a regular thing with your teams, there's still a lot of benefit that you can take from just learning about the patterns, about doctrine, and about having shared meaningful conversations with other stakeholders in your organizations. And that is me. Any questions?
Woo!
Thank you. Is Dennis still around as well?
Yeah, I'm here.
He's there.
Yeah. Does anyone have comments, questions, anything?
Well, I'll give a comment. I thought it was fantastic. Really, really good. I totally agree. And the point about mapping is much bigger than the maps themselves. And for example, in the doctrine table, I mean, that's continuously expanding anyway. Hang on, I've got some slides. Just to no, I don't want to do slides. I just want to show one thing.
I'm gonna
Also,
share
there
my
was
screen.
that cut down doctrine slide that was put on Twitter recently.
Yeah.
Sorry, say that again?
So, do you mind if I share something?
No, I already stopped sharing mine.
All right. So, view.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah. So let me just go back just a couple of slides. So one of the, I just verbally explain this. So one of the things that happens is as things evolve and we shift from product to commodity utility, it doesn't matter what we're talking about, nuts and bolts, electricity, computing, whatever it happens to be, you see inertia because of pre-existing practices and past success. You see capital flows out of past to this future way. And what you also see are new emerging practices. So I use this at Ubuntu, and I use this in the OEF in 2011. We knew that because of cloud, we would get a new set of practices. And so what happened is I did a population study, traditional companies, very much departmental, culture, source of inertia, focus was on profit, all about cost reduction, learning from analysts, and this next generation, which have become giants. We've moved more towards that, a service-based, game influable, disruption, open source as a weapon, learning from ecosystems, and a whole bunch of things which we now sort of mix in as, well, called DevOps. Anyway, these practices don't go nowhere. They're the ones I consider universally useful. So every time I do this, these observe changes, practices, I stick in my doctrine table. Now, I often give two views of the doctrine table. One is about phase of implementation, do these one first, these second, and another is just a categorization. And Steve Purkis wonderfully converted this, combined the two together. I've modified it slightly. And so this is what this looks like. So what I've got is categories at the top: communication, development, operation, maintenance, leading, and structure. And then the different phases, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if we just simply do phase 1, these are the most basic things that you should have: common language, the ability to challenge assumptions, understand what is being considered, i.e. have situational awareness, know your users, focus on user needs, remove bias and duplication, use appropriate methods, know the details, i.e. understand the components, bias towards data. And of course, that's phase 1, and then you move on to phase 2. Now, I've just changed it because of red-green. I've made it blue-red. This is a web engineering giant. They're pretty good at most things, but weak in a couple of areas and warning on others. And this is a financial services company, bank actually, and they're warning across the lot. So they don't know their users, they don't understand their user needs, they don't understand their environment, they have no common language, etc. Now it's okay, and this is the key thing, it's okay to be like this and be absolutely hopeless at all of this stuff, as long as all your competitors are exactly the same. I.e., it's okay to be rubbish as long as everybody else. It's like running away from the bear. It's okay if everybody's got really, really lead-weighted heavy boots on and can barely move, as long as all your competitors are the same. The problem is when one is different, i.e., they're more adaptable, and that's where the real trouble starts. Now, this is not a static table. This doctrine table came out of mapping. And what happens is every time we see industrialization of a space of technology, we get new practices start to emerge. And so this table is constantly expanding as well. And what's interesting for that is the companies who are already good at this stuff, because we've got a whole bunch of industrialization heading towards us, also helped on by COVID, because of the isolation economy. Their practices are changing even more. And so some are getting further and further and further behind, but they feel okay, because like in the banking world, they're just competing against people who are just like them. And the danger is when somebody new comes in and then it's getting worse. Sorry, anyway, I'll shut up at that point. But lovely talk, by the way. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Any other comments? Questions?
It was a really interesting point you made, Mario, around CISOs who more, if you look at the data, aren't usually around to see the impacts of the decisions that they're making, etc. I was wondering if there's any CISOs on the forum who kind of agreed, disagreed, and what their view or how they might kind of interpret and change the way that they act, you know, with that kind of a thought in mind, maybe.
Do we have any?
I've tried before in the past as a CISO with organisations, and then came up against the inertia of the board and shareholders, and left those organisations. So decided not to be a CISO for a bit. So yeah, I mean I agree with most of that stuff there, and both Simon and Mario have known me for a number of years, and it can be difficult implementing it actually, and getting board buy-in, incredibly difficult, especially when the finance department and CFOs, etc., have an inordinate amount of control, and if you can't get buy-in from them, because they, let's be honest, are quite stuck in the old world, because accounting is so sort of fixed and rigid from that era, you know, decades, eras ago, that trying to get them to change their minds, it can be very, very difficult.
Yeah. So actually that was also something, so I still haven't kind of widely announced that, but I guess I have now, but I'm taking a CISO role at a company in the next few months. And I had a few different options available to me. And I ended up having two offers, one from a company that already had about 10, 12 people, with the ingrained culture of that compliance being the gatekeepers, etc., in the whole of the organization working that way, right? So because these things, it's not usually just about security, right? It's about the company scaffolding, right? The way they approach governance, the way they approach finance, procurement, all those other things, they're kind of end up being on a similar boat, because those things tend to be organized. And they're also self-reinforcing, right? So you're going to have the security person going into lunch and talking with the procurement person in the finance, saying, "Oh, those guys, I just found out they got accepted the T's and C's from another SaaS solution," and blah, 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 right? So it's going to be self-reinforcing, because their worldviews, they're going to be telling, yeah, they're the ones doing wrong, they're the ones doing wrong, and it ends up being self-reinforcing. So I had the option of either going there or to a company where I would be building the security function from the ground up, and I just decided to go for the ground up, so I can hopefully start doing these things from scratch and not have all of that other inertia to deal with.
Mario, can you see the question in the chat?
I am. I was going to address that now. So the question is for everyone's, how would you go about tackling and using the doctrine table in an organization? Would you do it through interviews in some sort of audits? That actually relates to another talk that I gave a few weeks ago. It will depend on the context. The context is usually one of two, in my experience. Either we've got the inertia more happening from the gatekeepers, and when it's the gatekeepers that are the key constraint at the moment, then the main thing is to understand what the gatekeepers need to see in order to trust more. So I would be focusing on those first. Right, so making sure that people understand things in a slightly different way, but also addressing the parts on situational awareness, etc. Right, so getting the evidence to show them that the way it's currently happening, it's not necessarily working. But the challenge is also, going back to how I started, is the issue of affordances. Many organizations, they're not ready to hear the security guy saying what we're doing isn't working. They're going to have to drop their sales by 20 or 30% before there's something that I should learn here. Right? And sometimes security should not be the one trying to force that route, because it's probably not the right place. Right? So understanding the business affordances, the problems that they are dealing with, etc., and try to capitalize on those by adding doctrine or framing elements of doctrine to solve the problem that everyone agrees they have. Because until the organization sees what they currently have as a problem, they're not going to accept that you need to do things in a different way. Right. So the issue of affordances, understanding what the affordances that the current environment gives us, I think is what is key. On the other hand, if we've got an organization that is more what I call the rainbow makers, so people more kind of doing things fast and furious without any type of governance in place, right? So startups are usually in that space. So usually the focus will be more on giving them the visibility. So the stuff on communication, etc., introducing some of the communication techniques, such as introducing threat modeling, introducing some of those things that gives them the shared language to discuss the problem space, right? And those would be kind of my first points of action. But it will always depend. What I always say is capitalize on what everyone agrees is a problem right now, right? Because that's the only way that people will listen. If they think what they're doing is giving them all they need, they're not gonna change. Did I answer the question, Rostam?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask maybe like a further sort of wondering is that, you know, generally in organizations you have some sort of complexity, psychological and social complexities within organizations. So we know that, you know, the issue is there are, you know, let's say models, etc. But then how would you, let's say, break that? Especially when, as you mentioned, that there are a lot of gatekeepers, etc. And how would you go by and break this sort of ice and, you know, penetrate an organization that's really tight on, you know, its own ways of doing things?
Yep. So it's what I mentioned. It's picking up on the small things that they see as problems. If they don't see something as a problem, they're not going to fix it. Right? So we need to be very, very targeted on how we approach them. As soon as someone says that, for instance, the problem is one that, let me give you an example. The InfoSec team, they're always concerned about the engineers going fast and furious. Right? I've been working in the security field for about since 2002, so almost 20 years now. And I've yet to see a single penetration test that didn't come up with insecure cookies on the pen test report. Right? That's one of those that in 2020, there's no reason why we can't have a compliance as code check giving immediate feedback on cookies back to the developer. Right? It's very simple to write a test like that. So what I usually try to do is I go look at I'll ask, show me the last 5 or 6 or 7 penetration tests that your organization did, right? I try and go look for themes of the things that they've seen before, right? And I'm going to say, okay, these ones, I usually try and pick the easy ones, or if I've got access to kind of a proper QA engineer or a developer, I can ask them, can you do kind of more complicated tests to check for these? And I try to bring those into the development process as automated CI/CD tests. Right. In that way, when the next thing, a pen test comes around, I can see, look, what you had, what you were always seeing on the pen test reports, you no longer see them. Why? Because we're not taking advantage of shorter feedback loops. Right. And then we start those things that start coming up either through audits. For instance, if I've got an audit point that says you have an issue with logging or access management, right? Then we can build some integrated tests to say, I only expect to see role assignments to this particular type of objects, right? If I've got a user account to that thing, then I know it's wrong, right? And it's basically pick up on the problems that people think they have, right? And focus on those as the opportunities to show how benefiting from the shorter feedback loops can help them, right? And what it means to them.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, and I think you would also gain, as in when it comes to time-wise, is that, for example, if you have shorter feedback loops, you can focus maybe your pen tests on something that's more important to business logic, let's say, yeah. Related rather than other findings that you might. I have one more question, if that's okay. Is you mentioned in the engineering problem. Learning about from safety engineering. So yep. What did you mean by that, and what are sort of examples of those?
So there is something that is still not very well applied. So I've done some research, but I'm not by any means an expert. But what I would say is that what safety engineering do very well is understanding the impacts of the controls that they apply. And that is not something that usually in the threat modeling approaches to security that we go down to that level. So giving you an example that I only briefly touched on earlier is from a threat modeling point of view, we can say if we see this condition, then we apply this thing, right? What safety engineering is really good at doing is if I see this problem, I apply this control. But what happens if this control is applied before? What if happens if this control isn't applied in time and only 10 minutes afterwards? And it allows you to analyze the failure conditions in the application of controls in a much more interactive way that considers the scenarios that are triggered by user actions, both privileged and unprivileged. And that's not usually a level of detail that we go with threat modeling. So when we get things such as a rogue admin downloading 1,000 records or 2,000 records, and it's not something you expect in operation, that's not usually you've got that in typical approaches to threat modeling, that's not typically a scenario you envision and that you create the controls for. And in safety engineering, that is embedded into the way that they approach the practice of fault analysis.
Okay, well, makes sense. Thanks.
And it's also about the changes that I mentioned on resilience engineering at the end, right? The approach of centralized control approach to compliance versus guided adaptability, right? I think there's still a lot that can be leveraged in that space that I'd like to explore more in the next couple of months as well.
Cool. All right, I think we're wrapping up. The only comment to add is you don't need an organization to even understand or know that you're doing Wardley maps for you to use them, right? I think I've been using Wardley maps probably for, in real world for definitely, 2 to 3 years. I have to say that even now that I'm an organization that is actively embracing it, it takes a while for the maps to really become part of the culture and for us to, almost go through that doctrine of the share comms, the having a common language, simplify everything. But definitely thinking in maps, or kind of thinking of like the concepts that Mario has been speaking about is the first step, right? If it's, I actually think that, you know, and it was Simon today mentioned that it's a 7 year, you need 7 years to become really good at mapping. So I'm like I think I'm on year 4. So, but it takes, you know, the first main thing is for you to think in maps and to, you know, to almost behave in maps and to start to kind of, you know, in your head, you're already strategizing in there, you know, in fact, you know, it's interesting because I remember when I kind of presented, even Mario, when I presented maps for the first time to the team, the culture shock was enormous, right? You know, like the idea that, you know, I think I went there going, hey, this is the future, let's just do it. And it took a while, right, for even we start to talk about it. But just do it, right? That's the idea. Cool, right? Thanks everybody. Mario, great presentation.
Thank you.
Gonna
Thanks,
stop the
Mario.
recording.
Thank you.